What's up everybody, it's Wields. Welcome to yet another World of Tanks commentary. This time it's going to be a KV-5 review. The game that's playing in the background, well, I'll get to that later. But suffice it to say that it was a fairly entertaining match. Alright, so before we get started, I just want to say, in the interest of full disclosure, that I am not a good KV-5 driver. In fact, I think my win rate with this tank currently sits at an abysmal 42% or so. And although I do have an ace tanker medal with it and reasonable damage and XP per game stats, it seems that I just cannot win with this tank, whatever I do. And so now that you know this, take whatever I say herein however you want it. Alright, so the KV-5 is a Russian heavy tank. It's tier 8 and it's a premium tank. And as with all the other premium tanks, its stats are slightly worse than those of a normal tank. Now in terms of defense, the KV-5 actually has more health and overall armor than any other tier 8, bar none. It even has more in this department than the monstrous KV-4 does. However, this means that its offense has to be particularly weak to make up for this. Thus, it only carries a 107mm gun. Yep, the same 107 that used to be found on the tier 5 KV and Su-85. The same cannon that can now be found on the T-150, KV-2, and KV-3. That's 2 tier 6s and 1 tier 7 tank. That's not to say that this gun is a bad gun. It is not, by any stretch of the imagination. There's a reason it was removed from tier 5. It was just too damn strong. There's a reason that it's one of the best guns at tier 6 alongside the D25T. It has very good damage, penetration, and rate of fire. There's even a reason to consider using it at tier 7, and that's because the ammo cost is so astronomically low compared to the D25Ts that you don't lose out on much, but you do gain a bunch of credits, especially if you're not using premium. But of course, even I must admit that this gun is sorely lacking in tier 8. I mean, it receives a slight boost in accuracy and rate of fire. That's only to be expected considering the higher tier, and even the sheer size of the KV-5. I mean, the thing is huge. But that simply isn't enough to redeem the gun in my eyes. Now, this may be a deal breaker for some of you, and that's perfectly understandable. Even I said so in my last video. If you're looking for credits, those come with dealing more damage and spotting more tanks. And obviously, damage comes from your gun. If your gun isn't up to the task, well, let's just say you're not going to get many credits. And trust me, the KV-5 is not cut out for this gun. Alright, so I've been railing against this gun for the past few minutes or so. But let's get down to the nitty-gritty of it. Let's get down to the numbers to see where exactly it's lacking. The 107 ZIS-6M variant that's mounted on the KV-5 has an alpha of 300 and a rate of fire of 7 rounds per minute, which is actually more than adequate. 2100 damage per minute is actually pretty high for a tier 8 heavy. Without having done any calculations, I think it might be the highest damage out of any tier 8 heavy. The gun also has a typically Russian accuracy of .43, which, again, is above average. But the one stat that absolutely lets it down is the penetration value, which sits at a mere 167. Now this may not seem so bad if you compare it to the pen values of each nation's medium tree at tier 8, which are around 170-175mm usually. But you gotta remember that mediums have mobility going for them, that normally they can flank whatever tanks they can't spank. Whereas the KV-5 has a miserable top speed of 40 km per hour, which, it'll most likely only ever reach going downhill. And it also has a pitifully slow turret traverse speed. And so, for such a big and lumbering beast of a tank, the gun is truly disappointing. Not all is lost, however, as the devs were knowledgeable enough to have the KV-5 usually be at the top of the food chain when joining a battle. Now, of course, as of patch 7.5, the KV-5 no longer gets the godly preferential matchmaking. Whereas before it used to be at the top of the board 9 times out of 10, nowadays it'll see tier 9 tanks much more often, unfortunately, including the pesky tier 9 mediums that just make short work out of it. But still, it has preferential matchmaking in that it'll never see tier 10 machines unless you platoon up with others. And if that wasn't enough, with that patch, the devs even gave the KV-5 an extra 100 HP and a slightly faster turret traverse for its troubles. Anyhow, I mentioned the KV-5's armor earlier, and I'm sure many of you are anxious to know what I was going on about. So the KV-5's armor layout goes 180, 150, 140. That's front, sides, and rear. Now in terms of overall armor, that's the best that you can get at this tier and the next. What's more is that the KV-5 has slight angles all over the place that make it so that even if you think you can pen, sometimes your shot is just going to bounce off without even scratching the paint on it. The main problem, and of course there has to be a problem because otherwise half the server would be playing this tank, trust me, is that the KV-5 sports a massive frontal weak spot. Sort of like high tier German tanks actually, but worse in that you can't angle this weak spot in any way whatsoever. Now most of you already know what I'm talking about, but for those of you who don't and would like to know, I'm referring to what is colloquially known as the KV-5's R2-D2 turret. Now you might have seen it earlier in the video. This thing sits in front of the KV-5 and it's like a little machine gun turret. And what's really annoying and terrible about it is that just about any machine that the KV-5 encounters on the battlefield will be able to pen it through there. Now I don't know the effective or even the base armor on this thing, but considering that it's already angled because of its cylindrical form and that the only things that I've ever bounced off of it have been low tier 6 guns such as the Short 88 or the 76 M1A2 on the American mediums, considering those are the only guns that have ever bounced off of the R2-D2, I think it's safe to assume the worst. And so while on paper the KV-5 should be immune to most tier 6 tanks, in actuality it is not. Which leads me to why I chose this match in the first place. Truthfully, I had many replays to choose from, but I guess I just picked this one because it stuck to my head after I played it. Anyhow, you might have noticed earlier how I started turning my tank around and driving backwards. Let me assure you that as of yet, I have not went insane, and at the time of playing this game, I was in a relatively sound state of mind. Or at least I'd like to think so. Anyhow, the reason I showed my rear to all those enemy tanks is simple enough. Because when facing lower tier tanks, you actually have less of a chance of taking damage through the back of the KV-5 than through the front. Yes, it may be 40mm less thick, but it's uniform and mostly angled. And best of all, it doesn't present an obvious target that most people know where to shoot at. Now mind you, this obviously depends on what kind of tanks you're facing and at what distance, and it also depends a bit on the stupidity and incompetence of the opposing drivers. And what I mean by that is that at longer ranges, if a shot hits your R2-D2, it will most likely pen for damage, whereas if you factor in the pen drop-off from travel distance, you have a much higher chance of bouncing shells from your rear. And granted, it's kind of hard to aim for the weak spot from afar, but the risk of a shot randomly landing on your R2-D2 still exists. And by turning your tank around, you completely eliminate that risk. This tactic actually truly pays off at medium and closer distances, because so many people have gotten used to shooting KV-5s into R2-D2s that when confronted with its rear, they don't know where to shoot at. And you might be thinking to yourself, but Wields, isn't a shot to the back going to pen automatically wherever you place it? No, actually, it's not. If you consider the curved end of the KV-5, that surface can actually bounce a Type 59's shot. And I would know because I've both had shots bounce off from it, and I have both bounced shots off from it. This means that ISs and KV-3s will also have a hard time killing you, unless they know where to aim, or they get lucky with a few high penetration rolls. But usually by then, you'll have killed them already. When people see a KV-5 from behind, they just shoot in the general area without even aiming a second thought. They expect a guaranteed penetration, but in order for that to happen, they'd actually have to aim for the little boxes that are on top of the engine deck, because those are usually at a completely flat angle, and basically you'd be shooting at 140mm of armor. But shooting at the curved end of the KV-5 means that your effective armor potentially goes up much higher. Of course, this doesn't work very well against bigger tanks, nor is it very successful against Tigers and T-29s, which all have high pen values. So use this technique at your own discretion. And remember, the ideal and best technique will always be to play smart and to learn from your mistakes in order to keep improving. And you know what? In hindsight, maybe I should have listened to my own advice. If I'd used defensive mode against that Super Pershing and that IS, this game might have turned out differently. If I'd stopped advancing towards the cap like an idiot and went looking for cover instead, I might have lived long enough to make a difference. Who knows? Whatever the case, I most definitely misplayed the second half of this game. And that's unfortunate because it had started out so beautifully. Alright, so final verdict for the KV-5. If it was in the shop for the same price as before, definitely buy it if you like to drive heavy tanks. It's a very fun vehicle to roll around in, and at 7,500 gold, it's an absolute steal compared to the Lova, T-34, and IS-6. Those things are at 12,000 gold, I think. And as a little side note, if you ever come up against any one of those tanks in the KV-5, don't despair, don't worry. Your tank isn't any worse because it's worth slightly less in terms of gold. Because it's actually very easy for the KV-5 to destroy those other premium tanks. You just gotta know where to shoot at. Its gun has a very, very low penetration value, so if you ever do manage to acquire a KV-5 when it eventually goes back on sale, And again, I most definitely do think it will go back on sale. It's only been removed from the shop for a few months now, so give it a bit of time. If you do ever acquire one, just make sure you learn the weak spots for other tanks, especially the tier 8 and 9 ones. Just as a little precaution, you know? That's it for this time, folks. Please do like, comment, and subscribe. I will start working on a Type 59 review just as soon as midterms are over. And so again, please keep an eye out for that. And I will talk to you all later.